podcast audience. I'm happy to be speaking to you again today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rothman. I am a practicing ophthalmologist, a glaucoma specialist by training in New York. I spend about half of my time between the hours of 8 and 5 seeing patients. And the rest of the time, including everything after 5 o'clock until the following morning, I spend running InFocus Capital Partners, which is an ophthalmic-focused venture capital fund. We have closed our first fund about 2 years ago now, managing our portfolio. And we are currently in the middle of a capital raise for our second fund, also, which will be focused exclusively on ophthalmology. And it's a pleasure for me to be speaking today to somebody who I've interacted in the past with, but only by email, which is interesting. And the reason that that's the case is that Greg is on the board of a portfolio company of InFocus. So we have a connection in that way. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But today's podcast guest is Greg Kunst. He is the CEO of Aurion Biotech. And Aurion is one of the incredibly exciting companies in ophthalmology, looking to change the way we treat ophthalmic disease through a novel approach. And unfortunately, Aurion is not a portfolio company of InFocus because we don't have any more money, but yet at least. So we'll see. But
we'll talk soon.
Greg Kunst, welcome to the OIS podcast, and thanks for giving us your time today.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate the invitation.
So, I usually like to, I do a little bit of homework, not only on the board members of the companies that we invest in. So, there's that backstory, but also, I like to know a little bit about the podcast guests before they come on. And I'm always fascinated to try and hear the story of how somebody ends up in ophthalmology. And the reason that that's the case, and the reason I'm interested in your story, is because I don't know what it is about ophthalmology, and I guess maybe we could talk a little bit about that. But people who get into ophthalmology, they stay in ophthalmology. And it's a very, very, I think, unique phenomenon that doesn't necessarily occur, outside of this particular specialty. Maybe it also happens in derm, but I think that's pretty much it. And it seems that there's a lot of more cross-pollination between specialties and disease states and, parts of the body outside of here. But anyway, Greg, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background, your education, and kind of how you ended up as the CEO of Aurion.
Sure, happy to do that. So I kind of grew up. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. My father was a serial entrepreneur, actually, in eye care. So he was involved in physics very early on, before they were approved, and then they went and he and his colleague went and founded Ocular Sciences, which became at the time the fourth largest contact lens company before they took it public and sold it. And so I kind of grew up around eyes, and that's all I really knew. I was clearly not smart enough to be a doctor. When I was younger, I had aspirations for that, but decided that skiing and having a good time was more interesting for me at college than actually studying. So I went to BYU undergrad, focused on economics there, and then went on to Vanderbilt for business school. But I always knew I wanted to be in the business of medicine. But more specifically, all I knew was about the eye. And I grew up working for my dad and dreaming one day I had my chance in working in the eye. And so when I got to business school, I had spent the summer of my second year as an intern at Alcon, and to the chagrin of my dad, who always competed against Alcon, I went. He advised me don't do that, and I went there and loved it. And was supposed to come back, and after my second year, and that was about the time when they had got the non-approval letter on anacortate acetate, and so they had just laid off a bunch of people, so I had to go in a different direction. So I actually took a derivation in my career a little bit early on in the wound healing and tissue regeneration industry, which turns out to be quite helpful later on in my career as I come back in ophthalmology. But 5 years later, I came back to Alcon, spent a good deal of time at Alcon in both glaucoma and in Retina, and then went on to Glaukos in the early period of Glaukos. We started there in 2015 when we were a very small company, and we were doing about 25 million. Left when we were to come out Aurion, we were a $300 million company. And so that ride of seeing, going from a very embryonic commercial stage company into a significant player in the industry was fascinating. Best learning environment I ever had, led by led by Tom Burns, who's a role model of mine. And then, during my time at Glaukos, I had seen Kaneshita's first paper in 2018 published on corneal endothelial disease and corneal endothelial cell therapy, and I was mesmerized by it in 2018. I had showed Glaukos the paper and said we should look at this, and I think the team at that time said, it's kind of very early. But in 2021, I was sitting at home one night, it was December of 2021. I get an email from a headhunter that says, we have this cell therapy opportunity in Seattle targeting corneal endothelial disease. It was like 9 o'clock at night. I was laying in bed with my wife. I turned to my wife, said, what do you think about Seattle? She said, are you on drugs? At the time, I was living in Orange County, California. So going from the sunshine to the rain didn't make a whole lot of sense. But the next morning, I called the headhunter and said, I want this job. She said, that's not how it works. Like, you got to interview for this. But I knew the technology, and I've always gone, every time in my career when I made a decision, I've made a decision based on my heart. And I knew that this could be very transformational, and I was willing to bet everything I had, that it would work. And so we got to. I was the last, probably, if you talk to Tom Frenzy or Bill Link, I was probably the last in the list at the beginning, and I just I was relentless. I pushed and pushed and pushed, and wrote the company a business plan and said, I want this job. And I moved from probably last to pole position. And we took a job, moved to Seattle, and here we are.
So that's the very abridged version, but we left out some important details we're going to have to go back and talk about in a minute. But
sure.
two lessons there. It appears you're not supposed to listen to your father. Is that the one message that I got, which probably explains a lot of it? Right. Okay. Oof. I definitely screwed up on that one. But and the second is, family obviously matters, right? It's a lot of familial sort of direction here. Your father was in ophthalmology. You ended up in ophthalmology. That's also a fairly common theme inside of ophthalmology for a lot of people who end up running businesses. But I want to go back a second because you kind of glossed over some important details. You weren't kind of just at Alcon. You ended up being the glaucoma franchise director, did you not? I mean, your name was on a lot of stuff that, I'm a glaucoma specialist by training. So your name was on a lot of stuff and involved in a lot of things over the course of time there. That's not like a minor position at Alcon. I know the main driver of the top line at Alcon is the cataract business, but glaucoma is kind of a growing business during the time that you were there, was it not?
It was. So I joined right when they acquired Optinol, and my mission was to build out a glaucoma surgery business. And the lore of my time at Alcon was we had the Glaukos Alcon deal done, at least twice officially, and blown up, by the Novartis board. And so, I'm a very principled guy by nature. My job was to go in there and to build that business. And I fell in love with Glaukos, and we couldn't buy it. So I called Tom Burns one day in late 24 and Chris got there and said, hey, look, we can't buy you guys. Can I come join you guys? So my time at Glaukos, my time at Alcon was wonderful. I learned more about the international markets than I've ever learned in my entire career. The access to ophthalmologists around the world is remarkable with the power of Alcon. But what I also learned is my personality fits better in a smaller startup environment where where things can move rapidly. I enjoy chaos. Chaos is kind of my wife is like thriving chaos a bit. I don't like the regimented as much, and so that's what I've loved under my time at Glaukos and here at Aurion Biotech is every day is chaos, and we just deal with it, which is fun.
Right, and that was kind of the point that I was making. You started out kind of at the top of the funnel, right? Alcon, one of the biggest in the world in the ophthalmology space, and then you kind of narrowed it down and ended up at Glaukos, which again you glossed over a little bit, but you had a lot of responsibilities at Glaukos. You must have developed a substantial amount of skills being the VP of global marketing there, because it wasn't just a marketing position that you had. You were responsible for like 30 different things because smaller company, your skill set. So can you go into a little bit about the skills that you were, or the tasks you were responsible for there? Because that's a lot. It's a big list.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Early part of my career, when I was in tissue wound healing, tissue regeneration, I was at KCI, which we launched VAC therapy or negative pressure wound therapy. So we took a technology that we thought was $1 million or $2 million niche technology for pressure ulcers and turned it into a $1 billion plus breakthrough device for wounds. And part of the problem with the KCI story was they grew really fast, but they didn't think about things like market access and reimbursement around the world. So I was this young kid at a business school, and I raised my hand and said, look, I'll figure out this market access thing. So I took over responsibility at KCI early in my career for market access and more some of the globalization work in the company. Why that becomes important is when I joined Glaukos, at the time I joined, they had reimbursement in some of the MACs in the US. They were still working on commercial, but really, the goal post IPO was to grow the international markets. And so when I joined, I had responsibility for obviously the marketing organization, market access, and medical affairs. But the bulk of my experience coming in was the ability, to bring breakthrough technologies to the reimbursement process, and that's what we did at Glaukos. I mean, we were in the U.S. and kind of sort of in Germany when I started. By the time I left, we were in 17 direct markets and about 20 other indirect markets. We had reimbursement in France, UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, Singapore, South Korea, most of the Nordic countries. I mean, when you peel back the Glaukos story, particularly internationally, it's quite remarkable. I think they're well over $100 million internationally. They've got well over 100 people in the international markets. I mean, we back in 2015, that was a dream, and that's probably something I'm most proud of, because there's this notion that you just go international. Like every international market's different and equally difficult. Like it doesn't matter if it's a small market or a large market. I remember at times like just trying to open a bank account in Spain, was a total pain in the neck. Like these things like get in the way of and we kind of gloss over them as in the commercial model that we're going to launch in Europe. Well, Europe is 32 plus countries. Like it's not as simple as you just launch in Europe.
That's why everybody likes the United States as a market, right? It's a huge market, and it's one regulatory agency, it's one system. I get it. I mean, that's kind of why people from Europe want their product, moved here and trialed here. It's a much bigger, faster growth. But you're right. So you did all that, and you also handled the government affairs here, right? So Glaukos kind of leaned on you to handle some government affairs work for them.
Yes, correct. I mean, so obviously, one of the challenges I had during my time at Glaukos is it seemed like, it seems like every other week there's another reimbursement challenge in MIGS, and that really started, kind of 2 years into my time there. In 2017, it was Novitas made the first attempt to lower the professional fee. Back then, the professional fee was almost $1,000. Novitas tried to cut it to sub 100. At the time we thought that was the death of the company. And we got to rally the troops to get, to overturn that decision. And it took a lot of both persuasion with the MAC itself, but also, leveraging, Washington, DC, to intervene. And the story goes that there was a significant senator who made a phone call to Novitas that was able to help to see the light that this was not a good decision at that time. Now, I think as we fast forward in time, obviously, some things like professional fees, eventually they go before the AMA RUC committee, and that gets resolved, for good or better. But at that time, we thought that was a significant blow to the company, and it was all hands on deck. And that's the part I love about startups. Like you have existential risks. Either you fight or you flee. And I've surrounded myself with people that fight. And I can talk about this as Aurion as well. We've had plenty of near-death experiences. Like probably more than I can count on my hand, but somehow they get fixed. And I'm at a point in my career now where I actually, I don't worry about them as much, because I know the team will figure it out. And we have the people, the personality that's not going to give up. That's what I love about all startups. It doesn't matter what company they are. That's the DNA or gene profile of a successful company. Is they just won't let those existential risks take them down.
Right. It's an amazing discussion, and we can certainly go into that at another point in time, maybe. But it's part of the diligence process for us as an investor in a company like Aurion, let's say, is part of our diligence requires that we have some understanding of the reimbursement market access portion of approvable or an approved product at the end of the life cycle. During our investment time, it's almost impossible 5 to 7 years before a product may hit the market to understand what it's going to be like. And handicapping that, it's an incredibly difficult task. It takes a lot of opinions from a lot of good people, but you're right. You can start out with something that's the most incredible product in the world, and then find out at the end of the process, we have an approvable product that it's not worth anything. No one's going to pay for it. We've seen that with the pain management landscape. It's been littered with great technologies too expensive to be reimbursed to disappear. It's like my favorite line from Trading Places, when when Dan Aykroyd goes into the pawn shop with his $10,000 watch, and the guy says, "In Chicago, it's worth $50." And that's kind of how it is, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
like it is what it is at the time, but you're right, it's a huge challenge. So you end up building up all these skills. You run glaucoma for Alcon. You're taking care of a million different things for Glaukos, and then you funnel down even more. You get this opportunity at Aurion. So tell me about that. You get the call, you want the job, you pitch for it, you move yourself up the ladder, you get the position. What's the company like when you get there?
Yeah, so when I joined, the company was still part of CorneaGen, and so you can imagine, CorneaGen's a traditional tissue transplant company, and so one of we had two kind of objectives when I first joined. One was we needed to get the right team in place, and taking it well, let me back up. First, we needed to spin it out of CorneaGen. Second was we needed to build a team, and so we spent a good 6 months trying to find the right biotech cell therapy people to do that. And you can imagine we were CorneaGen, this technology was very embryonic in its development. And so convincing people to leave their hot biotech that they were in Cambridge or in Seattle to come to this little company called CorneaGen that was spinning out to become Aurion Biotech at the time was actually really hard. Like today, we're able to attract lots of good talent because our brand is built up. But back then, it was very difficult. And that was the peak of biotech. That was I mean, that was in 20, in early 2022, 2022 before, or 2021, I'm sorry, before we, biotech slid out. And so it was a fight. And so that was mission number two. Mission number three was to fund the company. And at the time, the company was CorneaGen was very thin on capital, and so we had to go raise money. We started in would have been September of 21, our process, right as the bottle was dropping out in biotech, and had to, as my CFO would say, I had to kiss a lot of frogs to find one to bite, and we ended up having our closing our $120 million round led by Deerfield. It was a fist fight to get that done. I mean, you can imagine at that point in time, some of the funds, the biggest funds on Wall Street, were down 40% year over year. They were not going to put private money to work. I mean, if you're a large fund and you're worried about liquidity, the last thing you're going to do is put private money to work, even on an excellent asset. And we had a number of situations where we got very deep with some big marquee funds, but they had that issue. And what I was told is, get the lead, everything will come together. Well, that actually wasn't true. And so we had the term sheet in December of 21 from Deerfield, and then getting the syndicate actually turned out to be harder because the market kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Right. We closed our round in April of 22. But like I said, it was difficult moments. There were times I said to my wife, I'm not sure we're going to make this is going to work. And the only reason why it worked is because we had clinical data in our hands. Had we not had clinical data, I'm not sure this company would have gotten funded.
Yeah, it's a huge, it's a huge change. And look, we've seen it. We have 12 portfolio assets, right? And we fortunately helped to keep, every single one of those companies viable and moving forward. Somehow, some of that was a little bit of, I guess, fortuitous luck that we had funded those companies prior to the real significant downturn that occurred, around COVID and subsequent to that, which you just described. But there's been a huge, sea change in the perception of where venture lies in the investment portfolio of big funds and how much healthcare is going to be a part of that. There's a lot of uncertainty still, and you see, look, I currently am not making any investments until we launch our second fund. And I'm still getting, 10 to 15 new outreaches a week from companies looking for capital because it's just an incredibly challenging time. And whether it's going to change, some global economic, headwind disruption that's going to allow people to feel like they can go out and deploy capital again, or whether it's going to be an interest change thing, everybody's kind of waiting for something. And it's incredibly challenging. So the fact that you got funded all during that time is kind of incredible, and it speaks to the validity of your prospects. But it's been very hard, and not just in ophthalmology. So congrats on getting the funding done during probably what was the most difficult time. It was also right after the SVB fiasco, right? So Silicon Valley Bank was, collapsed, and the whole thing was kind of like a sort of a perfect storm of badness for life science, which sort of filtered directly into ophthalmology. But So you get there, you get your team, you get your money, and kind of where were you at the science at that time? I know you had clinical data, but what was the plan with all that money? What were you going to do?
Yeah, so we had a choice very early on, and I give Bill Link a ton of credit because this was his idea after we had acquired the technology from Kinishida's labs and brought it into Cornigen and created Aurion Biotech. Was most biotechs would say go right into a U.S. trial. What we said is hold on, let's go to El Salvador, let's learn more about the procedure and make sure we got this right before we go to U.S. clinicals. And so we ended up going to El Salvador a number of times. There were three different studies we ran in El Salvador. We really went down there originally to validate that we get similar results with U.S. surgeons, in El Salvador to compare to Kinishida's early results, and we saw that early on. Two, we really wanted to make sure that we fine tune the procedure because I'm a medical device guy by background, and so procedure technique really matters to me. In so many big pharmas miss on that, particularly in drugs that need to be delivered into the eye. They don't spend enough time on how to make sure the elegance of the procedure is right. And so we spend extra time in El Salvador getting that right. And in our procedure, there's a polishing step. And we wanted to make sure we had that foolproof. And we did that in El Salvador. And then last week we had some work on dose ranging that we wanted to do. And so we took a more kind of atypical approach, do that internationally first, and then go to our U.S. clinicals. Because one would argue we could have gone to our U.S. clinicals from earlier in our process. Now we chose not to do that, and we just recently fully enrolled our phase 1/2 in the U.S. But I think we spent time perfecting this before we went in, and we had that luxury because we had clinical data to fund the company. If we didn't have clinical data to fund the company, I'm not sure we would have had that luxury. But I think in the end, when the story is told, 10 or 20 years from now, I think I'll be sitting here telling you the best thing we did was go to El Salvador, work out the kinks before we start our U.S. clinicals.
So that gets done, and then you start the U.S. clinical trial process. Is that correct? Can you tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about the actual technology? I mean, cell therapy, it's kind of exciting, and it's really just making its way into ophthalmology, right? There's other disciplines that involve cell therapy for some time, but ophthalmology is kind of just at the forefront of this right now. My limited knowledge and experience in even communicating with cell therapy companies comes through my interactions with Brian Culley at Lineage. I had the opportunity to speak to him in the past and get involved in understanding his science. Public companies, so never really had the opportunity to make an investment, and they subsequently developed a strategic relationship with which helped them significantly. But there are challenges and there are unique things that need to be overcome and considered when it comes to cell therapy programs, and there are even more unique things when it comes to the eye. So can you just explain to the audience a little bit about what your procedure actually is and how you do it?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of starting at a high level. We're an allogenic cell therapy. So, what that means in plain English is we take the corneas from deceased donors. We're able to replicate. We remove the endothelial cells off a deceased donor. We're able to replicate those. Those endothelial cells in our proprietary process in our manufacturing facility. And for every one donor today, we can create about 1,000 treatments. Now that number will go up over time, but you think about the nature of corneal transplant today. We know around the world for every one person that receives a cornea, there's 70 other people waiting. And so if you have a technology now that we can go from 70 people waiting to creating over 1,000 treatments for every donor, we've all but solved the supply issue around the world. But that's only a small part of the story. The bigger part of the story is, there's only about 300 corneal specialists in the U.S. that regularly do corneal transplant, and the reasons why are very straightforward. It takes time. Frankly, corneal specialists lose money. From a facility, kind of the economic point of view on corneal transplants. It's a love of treating patients, not a strong business proposition.
It's not a big money maker.
No. And so now you're taking a procedure that can be done by, frankly, any anterior segment specialist. So all 8,000 plus cataract specialists in the United States could be doing this. But lastly, it's minimally invasive, so you can move it early in the treatment algorithm. Because what's the quandary of the question that we continue to look at is, the NIH supports this idea that 4% of the population of the age of 40 is prevalent or Fuchs. That would suggest there's 32 million eyes in the U.S., Europe, and Japan that are prevalent, but yet we only treat 70,000 through endothelial keratoplasty every single year. It's kind of a head scratcher. You sit back and say, well, that's a large market, but we don't treat very many, and that's what I think we're attacking with our cell therapy and some of the others that are in this area. Is this ability to create continuous supply, simplify the procedure, and reduce the invasiveness of the procedure and the recovery, and then ensure it can be done by the broadest possible number of ophthalmologists. That becomes really important in the U.S., but even more so outside the U.S. Interestingly enough, in Canada, there's a 6 to 24 month waiting list for endothelial keratoplasty for people that are 20, 60, 27 or worse. I mean, they can't drive a car and they got to wait in the waiting list. In Japan, the standard for doing EK is 2100 or worse. You could actually drive a car at 2090 in Japan, which is remarkable. I mean, frightening. And so these are problems that we're trying to fix. Then you get in the emerging world, you get in places like India and China. Like, the only way you're going to be able to do this and be successful is you got to be able to put it in the hands of a general ophthalmologist or an anterior segment specialist. And it's got to be kind of out of the box. It's got to be something very simple that can be deployed. There are 7 million people. Most of those people are in remote parts of the world that are blind simply because they don't have access to corneal tissue. That's what I think we're trying to solve with Aurion Biotech. It's not just for the U.S. This is a global solution, and that's not been true for most cell therapies. Most cell therapies, you look at the CAR-Ts in cancer. CAR-Ts are wonderful for hematological malignancies. They've been a godsend. The problem, though, is they're only for the rich. I mean, exactly. And they're not scalable. You can't do a CAR-T outside of a major academic hospital, like in New York or here in Seattle. It's not something scalable. What we're doing is it's highly scalable. It will be the first mass market cell therapy that we've seen in medicine. And we're treating it like we would treat an antibody or a small molecule in our commercialization and distribution. And so, I think this is one where we have an opportunity to bring the fortune of cell therapy to the masses, which is interesting, particularly in cell therapy. What we're doing is we're asking natural cells to continue to be natural cells. We're asking endothelial cells that have always been endothelial cells, always want to be an endothelial cell, to continue to be an endothelial cell. That's why our prospects are high, because it's going to be effective and it's going to be safe, most importantly, because we're not tricking the body. We're asking the body to continue to its function that it's always had, through those cell types.
Well, and I'm gonna spend 1 minute just educating the audience for people who don't know, because there are people who maybe just be investors who listen to this and not understand. But I'm going to take it out to a very high altitude. So people who have, corneal, some sort of corneal disease that makes the cornea not clear. It's opaque, needs to be replaced somehow. The majority of the cause of that has to do with the backside of the cornea, called the endothelium. And in the past, we would either have to replace the entire backside of the cornea through a fairly complicated surgical procedure that required a single donor for a single recipient, or the whole cornea, which was even more complicated. And what Aurion is effectively doing is, instead of transplanting the whole cornea, they're just taking the endothelial cells, the actual cells that make up that batt lining, and injecting them into the eye of a person with endothelial disease, and then the cornea becomes functional again. It's kind of that simple. I mean, there's a lot more to it, and it's not important for the audience to understand all the detailed steps of the actual procedure, but that's effectively what's getting done. So we are used to now taking an entire chunk of human cornea from one person and putting it to another person, and that works. But it's a significant corneal procedure, significant microsurgery, requires significant training, and is only a one-to-one. Aurion has taken the important cells, the cells that you want that you're actually transplanting, creating 1,000 treatments from a single donor, and making it as simple as injecting it into the eye. That's effectively what you're doing. Correct? I mean, I didn't missuspect.
That was perfect.
So that's the disruption here. And in full disclosure, InFocus very early on in its career invested in what I would consider to be a competitive technology that also works, is different in how it works. But the concept of doing this is very exciting to an investor like myself, because we understand that the limitations of continuing the trend of infrequent corneal transplantation, lack of supply, lack of training, lack of will, needs to be overcome. And it was one of the first investments that we made. You guys weren't available at the time, of course. And we are a multiple shot on a single goal kind of fund. But clearly the concept is important to people who understand, kind of the unmet need in ophthalmology, and this is clearly an unmet need. One other point I want to make is, do not even attempt to get me to feel bad for cornea specialists. My God, they get to offset their corneal transplants with refractive surgery and LASIK. You know, when I do glaucoma surgery, I do trabeculectomies. You know what I get to offset my trabeculectomies with? Tube shunts. Okay, there's no feeling bad for the cornea guys, but I appreciate your sentiment. I'm sure they appreciate it. Just falls on deaf ears from a glaucoma guy. So I'm sure you can appreciate that. Okay, so you've got this amazing technology. You've got this amazing. What are the issues here? I mean, from what I understand, this is still an expensive process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the kiss of death for cell therapy companies is in CMC. I mean, so I think we've checked the clinical box, and frankly, we'll turn the next data card over, early next year once we look at the phase 1/2 data. But I think the big hurdle for us is making sure that our CMC is tight. For those of you that listen to the podcast and don't know what that means, is that's the repeatability of the manufacturing process. And I think we've made big strides here. We effectively took an academic process from Kinoshita and turned it into a fully scaled mechanized approach. And I think that's I would say where we started from 3 years ago to where we are now is demonstrably different and better. But that's where we're spending our time and our efforts. But it's expensive. I mean, the cost of CDMOs and manufacturing is probably more than half of my burn. And sometimes when you look at my burn, some of my investors, or potential investors and current investors, like their eyes go crazy. But that's the nature of cell therapy. And while cell therapy has lots of promise, the development costs are immense.
Yeah, so that's obviously so scaling the production basically is what you're talking about, is trying to figure out how to produce, and then you're a market access guy, right? You understand. What do you think about the challenges of getting this to become an approved procedure? And I'm just asking for maybe some of my own edification, maybe I'm doing a little diligence for myself, but certainly for the audience. I mean, you have a novel procedure, right? There's significant costs associated with it. Most people, I think, naively would assume that you go in there and you say, this is how many corneal transplants are getting done. This is what do they cost. Here's how many cell therapy procedures we can do. Here's what it costs. So, we should be approved because it's cheaper, safer, faster, whatever. What's the pitch? How do you go in and say to, payers, here's why this needs to get paid for. And this is why we think it's going to change the way, ophthalmology patients are treated.
Well, interesting enough, your portfolio company, Terafel, did a lot of early work on this. So they published a paper at DP Dollywall that actually looked at the 3-year cost of DMEC and DSECT, and the conclusion was it's about $20,000 when you look at all the direct and indirect costs. And there are other papers that cite ranges from $17,000 to $35,000. If you look at the total underlying cost, when you start out with the total underlying cost, you're not just talking about the DMEC DSECT itself, which that's around $7,000 to $10,000. But then you start looking at the rebubbles, the failures, et cetera, and the list goes on and on. And so that's the approach we're taking with payers. My commitment as a CEO is we're going to price to value. I mean, meaning in the translation of that is we're going to figure out what the 5-year cost of DMEC and DSECT, and that's going to be our price. I mean, and you can do simple math to get there. As you look in Europe, that number is probably closer to $10,000 to $15,000. You look in the U.S., it's somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000. And we're going to be able to look at the eyes of payers and practitioners and say we're not taking a dollar more than what the economic value is. That'll get reimbursement, but more so, I think ophthalmologists, in my experience, want to be comfortable that they're doing something that's value creating for the patient and for the healthcare system. And that's how we'll deal with reimbursement around the world. And so that takes some discipline, right? I mean, launch cadence will matter. I mean, we'll launch in Japan now as we speak, but we'll launch in the U.S. second, and then we'll take a step order approach, based upon the market's ability to reimburse and making sure that we don't put ourselves into a corner. But eventually, we'll get to the entire world.
Yeah. I mean, that's the right way to do it. And ultimately you work backwards, right? Figure out what you're going to get reimbursed, and you figure out how to make sure that you can make money doing it. I mean, that's kind of the way you have to do it. And as you get closer and closer to the finish line, I think you're more able to do that. I think it's much harder when you're first starting out to understand what it's going to look like, as we've already discussed. But 5 to 7 years, when you started this in 2021, or how do you really know what the reimbursement landscape is going to look like in 2026 or 2027?
You don't. You make your best guess, and
right.
I mean, again, but economics. I mean, so we always point at the B and say we're going to price and value economics, and why that's important is that's why we spend so much time in CMC, is because when I joined, the team was celebrating. Oh, we got a product that we can make for $3,000. And I said, that's great, but Europe is going to be $10,000 type of price. I need the cost of goods sub $1,000, and more so if I want to get to the rest of the world, in the emerging world, I need it even lower than that. So we've probably gone further than most startups would on the cost of goods sides, because we knew our ability to access the entire world was hinged on that principle, because economics vary by country, and to access the entire world, we need a product that we can make. We need to make a profit. So to do that, we need to have a cost of goods that's very affordable, that allows us to go anywhere. The more we do that, the more likely we hit our mission, to address corneal endothelial disease around the world.
Absolutely. That's the absolute correct way from an investor. That's exactly kind of what I want to hear. So I think that's the smart and proper way, and I think it'll lead to successful understanding of how to get your product everywhere in the world. What is the so the future of this company? So the ophthalmology is great. There's a lot of corneal blindness out there, but really, if you think about it, developing the process by which you can generate 1,000 treatments from a single donor is really the secret sauce here, right? It's really cell therapy comes down to how much treatment can you get from your process. And that was something that I've learned again from Brian at Lineage, and understood a lot of that discussion. There's more than just corneal endothelial disease that could benefit from cell therapy in a process that's kind of scalable like you have. So what are your thoughts on the future of the company outside of corneal endothelial disease?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the eye is perfectly targeted for cell therapy, and the reasons why is pretty straightforward. I mean, one is the eye is very accessible compared to most parts of the body. I mean, so we can actually get cells to where they need to go. Imagine trying to get cells to the liver or to the pancreas or whatever. That's a little more difficult. Two, it's we don't see the systemic responses that most cell therapies deal with in other parts of the body. But three, the eye is immunosanctioned. And what it means is we don't have the kind of reactions that most cell therapies have to deal with, and because of that, we don't have to do some of the fancy tricks, at least in program one, like gene editing, to be able to deliver our cell therapy. We don't have rejection risk per se. And so when I think about that, we start thinking about where else in the eye can we go, and sort of how our track goes is what we're dealing with is really a cell death in cells that cause blindness. And can we replace those cells? And you start to think about areas where cell death is part of the underlying pathology of ophthalmic diseases, and they come most of our major diseases. We think about that. Certainly in glaucoma, we look both at trabecular meshwork and into the nerve. I mean, my dream one day is to replace ganglion cells and regenerate the nerve. Everyone says I'm crazy and we can't do it, but we'll try one day. I mean, that's a moonshot, but I still believe there's a way to replace ganglion cells and restore function. My CSO says there's no way the brain refires, but we'll see. I mean, the other areas I think about, certainly, other companies are focusing on RP and RPE cells in general. That makes sense, from a replacement strategy. The challenge there is the multicellular structure. Multicellular structures are hard to get cell therapies to work, but I think the idea of it's really interesting. But as you go to the front of the eye, I think there's a number of diseases that are very interesting, for this prospect. I mean, I think of things like limbal cell deficiency. Now the challenge of limbal cell deficiency is on the epithelium. So you do run the risk of rejection, and so gene editing would probably have to be used there. And we have some expertise in gene editing in our company, so that's something we think about. We also think about things like neural cells. So you start to think about NK and what we do in neurotrophic keratitis. The beauty of neural cells is NK is a fast progressing disease, and so if you can demonstrate efficacy in NK, then you start to get a little more confident that a neuroprotection strategy or neuroregeneration strategy in the back of the eye could be real.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that there, pretty much it applies to everything. The complex structure of ophthalmology, requires that, so many other factors be considered when talking about gene therapy. People think like, well, the liver is the liver, right? The eye is like 7 different tissue, different organ systems. It's complicated, when it comes to the retina, but you're right. I think there's loads of applicability, and I think ultimately between gene therapy and cell therapy, we're going to have some cures in the future, and I think that's really what we need in ophthalmology. So, Greg, I think we kind of run out of time a little bit. I'm going to start to get yelled at. But I want to thank you. I think Aurion's an incredibly exciting company. I think, being at the forefront of cell therapy for ophthalmology is critical. The concept makes perfect sense. Your data so far, from what we know, is really fantastic, and I think you have the opportunity to really change the incidence of blindness around the world by allowing people who previously had no access to, treatment for corneal blindness to get, effectively cared for. So I appreciate the effort that you're putting into, trying to solve some of these problems. It's the reason that, I have transitioned from clinical care into investing in ophthalmology, because it's the kind of stuff we want to see come out of, some of the earlier investment process that goes on. People look at, big companies look at innovation differently than investors do, right? And you've managed to take your big company experience back to a startup and, almost guaranteed its success. So congratulations to you. And I'm looking forward to seeing what, some of that flip data card when it's going to happen. So please keep everybody informed. For the OIS audience, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen again. Look into Aurion, fantastic company. Greg's really done an amazing job there. And I'm looking forward to speaking to everybody on the next podcast down the road. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.